Let's now take you to our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, for more on the ground on what is happening. Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. Where are we now on the program?
Well, you might recognize the statue behind me over my left shoulder, Bongiwe. That is the statue of former President Nelson Mandela, which was unveiled outside South Africa's embassy here in the United States capital, Washington, D.C. And if you hear some engines roaring in the background, that is the convoy, the cavalcade, if you will, that is accompanying President Cyril Ramaphosa. The blue lights, officers of the local metropolitan police escorting his entourage as he now departs this embassy event where he's just met with members of the Congressional Black Caucus and members of veterans of the anti-apartheid lobby here in the United States. J.C. Jackson, Reverend J.C. Jackson's son, Jonathan Jackson, spoke about the relationship between struggle veterans in the United States and South Africa. We heard from Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, who really talked about this long-standing relationship and the synergy between South Africa and that you know, for many people here in the United States and in South Africa, the economic struggle for emancipation continues. And then, of course, President Ramaphosa took to the floor. And the biggest takeaway from that discussion is his focus on seeking to draw greater black business in general from the United States to invest in South Africa. But he also talked about the Russia Malign Activities Act that South Africa is lobbying against, right? This is a legislation that passed the House of Representatives in March this year by a large majority, and of course might now be taken up by the Senate. And he's really used part of the speech to push back at those efforts. But of course you have the legislature that has a mind of its own, and of course the executive, but really lobbying congressional leaders that it would be antithetical for the South African project, for South Africa's development, for Africa's development in general, if this act were to pass the United States Senate and become law, because it would hurt South Africa's independence and sovereignty in terms of the relations it seeks to have with countries like Russia and China that are also very much involved in the African project. Of course, earlier today, just up the road from where we are, he met with Vice President Kamala Harris. That was a breakfast meeting. I understand that from those discussions, Bongiwe, they talked about climate change, the just energy transition. We understand there was also some conversation about battery storage capacity, a business-to-business relationship in terms of the green revolution and transition that needs to happen in South Africa. They talked about building reliance of health systems against pandemics and local vaccine production. They reaffirmed the importance of the TRIPS waiver for diagnostics and therapeutics. I think what we had out of the World Trade Organization in Geneva is a TRIPS waiver for just vaccines. They're still pushing now for a waiver on diagnostics and therapeutics. And he said they were committed to cooperation on space exploration with a focus on supporting local industries. This is new. We need to get more information about this, but they're talking about science and technology and space exploration in particular. And one begins to think about how South African industry could benefit from greater partnerships in that regard. And then they also affirm the partnership in support of peace and security in the SADC region. And when you think of that, you think about what's happening in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Of course, the proliferation of militia groups there that has seen a rise, including from the M23. And then, of course, closer to home in Mozambique, northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, and the efforts that are being led by military contingents from SADC countries, including South Africa, to arrest the insurgency that has happened in northern Mozambique. So quite a plethora of issues on the table here in his discussions with the Vice President and now with congressional leaders here at the South African Embassy in Washington.
And Sherwin, I mean, a lot of, focus by those who are watching these talks very closely to also see what else is on the, on the table, especially when he meets, President Joe Biden a little later on. Some saying that those discussions are probably going to be frank and the two leaders meeting is quite significant. Let's talk about what happens now.
You know, it's a great way to just describe the tone and the tenor here. They are really throwing out the red carpet for the South African delegation. Just the entourage, the motorcade, is quite an impressive motorcade for a visiting president in the United States. I think local Americans probably think it's President Biden himself going by sometimes. So they are really feting the South African president. They're talking a lot about how South Africa's leadership in Africa and on global issues is important. There was a briefing yesterday by a senior U.S. administration official to lay out their ideas in terms of this visit. They say things like South Africa is a leading country in Africa, an important voice globally. They talked about ending COVID, reversing the tide of democratic backsliding and responding to the global food crisis, shaping the international rules-based system. They want South Africa's position on that. Remember, South Africa has placed the United Nations and the multilateral fora that represents at the center of its foreign policy. They talk about, the US does, they talk about a world facing growing divisions and that we cannot make progress without shared global priorities, without South Africa's leadership and contribution to that. And then very interestingly, on the geostrategic situation as it relates to the war in Ukraine, they said, as the conflict has evolved, we're eager to hear South Africa's perspective on how do we reach a just conclusion to the conflict and what are the means of doing that. So the posture here is not just that we want to give weapons to Ukraine, we also want to understand South Africa's perspective on how we end this conflict. We are hearing from people like Naledi Pandor that they're talking now about an eminent group of persons that might include the UN Secretary General and other probably former heads of state, to really start looking at how we reach a conclusion in this war, because that really hasn't been a major focus. If you heard the Secretary General speak ahead of the UN General Assembly earlier this week, he talked about how he had just had a conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin and does not see a window towards a peace negotiations at this time. So what happens in this bilateral relationship could certainly influence what happens at the multilateral level, Bongwe.
Interesting to hear, showing views of, outsiders looking in as to how South Africa is. But thank you so much for putting us into perspective there. We'll catch up with you a little later on. That's SABC correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease.